I didn't cry when my brother called. I didn't throw my phone across the room. I just sat there on the edge of my bed in my apartment in Calgary, staring at the wall, feeling something settle in my chest like concrete hardening in winter. He said my mother wanted just immediate family for Thanksgiving this year. He said it like it was nothing, like I hadn't driven 6 hours every single November for the past 11 years. Like I hadn't bought the cranberries and the good butter and the pie shells every single time because my mother always forgot. He said her exact words were, "Tell her it's going to be a smaller thing this year. She'll understand." I understood perfectly. I set my phone down on the nightstand, face up, and watched the screen go dark. Here's what nobody in my family knew about me at that point. I was 31 years old. I had just sold my minority stake in a software company I'd quietly co-founded 6 years earlier for just under $2 million after taxes. And I owned a 4-bedroom timber frame cottage on a private lake in the Muskoka region that I had been renovating for 2 years. I had never mentioned it, not once. It wasn't a secret, exactly. It was more that no one had ever asked what I was doing with my life in a way that expected a real answer. To my family, I was the one who moved away, the one who never settled down, the one who worked in computers, my mother's word, and didn't have a husband or a baby or a house in a suburb they could picture. I was the question mark at the dinner table, the one they felt slightly sorry for without ever saying so out loud. My brother had a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage in Oakville. My mother adored him in the loud, demonstrable way she'd always reserved for him. The birthday cakes with real candles, the framed photos on the mantelpiece, the phone calls that lasted an hour. With me, it was texts, short ones, sometimes with a typo she didn't bother correcting. I want to be honest here because I think that matters. I had been quietly building my life for years, and for years I told myself it was enough that I knew, that I didn't need them to see it. I had convinced myself I was past caring. I wasn't. The call came on a Tuesday in early October. Thanksgiving in Canada falls in mid-October, so I had about 12 days. I sat with it for 2 of those days. I went to work, I made coffee, I walked my dog along the river path, and I let the thing my brother had said just sit inside me like a stone. On the 3rd day, I opened my laptop. I had a list of people, not a long one, who had quietly shown up for me over the years. My university roommate, who had driven to Calgary when my father died and slept on my couch for a week without being asked. 2 colleagues who had become real friends during the years we'd worked 18-hour days together building something from nothing. My father's sister, my aunt, who had always been kind to me in a way that felt unconditional and slightly radical in the context of our family. A neighbor from my building who was 83 years old and had nobody. 2 friends from back home who had always felt slightly left out of family events because they weren't blood. They'd been my people since high school, the kind who knew everything and said nothing to the wrong people. I started making calls. "I'm doing Thanksgiving at the cottage this year," I said each time. "I'd really like you to be there. I can cover the drive up or the flight, whatever you need." Every single one of them said yes. I spent next week and a half preparing. I hired a woman from a catering company in Huntsville to handle the main meal, because I didn't want to spend the whole weekend in the kitchen. I ordered flowers. I pulled the good linens out of storage. I had the dock repaired so people could sit out there in the evening with a blanket and a drink if they wanted. I drove up the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, unlocked the house, turned on all the lamps, and stood in the kitchen for a minute just taking it in. The high ceilings, the stone fireplace, the view of the lake through the big windows, the maples on the foreshore that had gone completely red and gold. I had built this. I had paid for this. With my own money, from my own work, without any help from anyone. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving and poured myself a glass. By Thursday afternoon, 9 people were at my cottage on Lake Rosso. My aunt and her partner drove up from Hamilton. My old roommate flew in from Vancouver. I covered her flight. My 83-year-old neighbor, whose name was Bernard, had never been to Muskoka in his life and spent the first 20 minutes standing at the end of the dock just looking at the water. My high school friends drove up together in one car and arrived with 2 cases of Ontario craft beer and a homemade butter tart pie, which I hadn't asked for, but which made me almost cry in a good way. We ate outside on the long table on the deck, even though the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, because the sky was clear and someone had the idea to bring out the blankets and fairy lights, and it was too beautiful not to. The catering team had done an extraordinary job. Turkey, maple glazed root vegetables, a wild rice stuffing that everyone kept going back for. Bernard gave a toast that was short and completely sincere and made 3 people tear up. And my roommate took about 400 photos on her phone, and we stayed at the table until almost 10 o'clock just talking. I had not felt that full in years. Not that kind of full. At some point during dinner, my roommate, who has the social media instincts of someone 20 years younger than she actually is, posted a series of photos to her Instagram. The cottage lit up in the evening, the table covered in food and flowers, the lake in the background. She tagged the location. She tagged me. I didn't think anything of it. I had my phone in my jacket pocket, and I was focused on whether Bernard needed more wine. It was my cousin who saw it first. My cousin, who follows my roommate, for reasons I have never understood, texted my brother. My brother showed my mother. My mother, at that point, was sitting at what I was told later was a significantly less impressive Thanksgiving table. Smaller gathering, a store-bought pie, some tension about seating arrangements I had nothing to do with. My phone buzzed once, twice. Then it started going continuously. I looked at the screen and saw 17 messages and 4 missed calls in the span of about 8 minutes. I excused myself from the table and walked down to the end of the dock, standing in the dark with my phone. The messages were not warm. My mother, where is this? Whose house is this? My brother, can you call me? My brother again. This is Mom's cottage, which made no sense and told me a lot about what story he had apparently constructed in his head about how I'd afforded any of this. My cousin, a string of messages that started confused and got progressively resentful. And then my mother again. I can't believe you did this on Thanksgiving. You're doing this on purpose. I stood on the dock for a few minutes. The lake was flat and black and there were stars, which you can actually see properly from Muskoka in a way you can't from the city. I could hear laughter from the deck behind me. Bernard was telling a story. My roommate was laughing at something. I typed back to my mother, I just had some friends up to my place for the holiday. I hope you had a nice evening. That was all I said. I turned my phone over in my hand, put it in my pocket, and walked back up to the table. By the time I woke up the next morning, there were 41 missed calls. I lay in bed and read through them slowly with a coffee. My mother had called 8 times. My brother had called 12. My cousin 6. There were also calls from 2 relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. My mother's youngest brother, who had never once called me for any reason in my adult life, and a family friend who was deeply embedded in my mother's social circle and whose involvement told me my mother had been making calls of her own. There were also texts. A lot of them. The theme, if I'm being honest, was not concern. Nobody was asking if I was okay, or whether something had happened, or how I'd spent the holiday. The theme was entitlement dressed up as hurt feelings. My brother had apparently told my mother that the cottage must be some kind of company thing, meaning he'd assumed it couldn't really be mine. When it became clear from the photos that it was in fact a private residence and that I had in fact hosted what looked like a warm, beautiful, well-catered Thanksgiving dinner without any of them, the story shifted. Now I was being secretive. Now I was excluding them. Now, in my mother's words in one particularly long voice message she left at 2 a.m., I had always been like this. I didn't respond to any of it that morning. I made pancakes. I made coffee. My roommate and I took Bernard for a walk on the trail behind the cottage, and he told us about the first apartment he'd lived in when he came to Canada from Portugal in 1971, and how he'd eaten canned soup for 3 months straight because he didn't have money for anything else, and how he'd gotten a job at a printing company and worked there for 37 years. He told it plainly, without sentiment, and it was one of the most interesting conversations I'd had in a long time. We ate leftover turkey sandwiches for lunch. By early afternoon, people started heading out, long drives, early flights. My aunt was the last to leave. She hugged me for a long time in the driveway and said very quietly, "Don't explain yourself to them. You don't owe them an explanation." Then she got in her car and drove away, and I stood in the gravel driveway until I couldn't see her taillights anymore. I went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table with my phone. There was a final message from my brother, sent that afternoon, that was different in tone from the others. Quieter. More direct in a way that felt more honest and therefore more painful. He said he felt stupid that he hadn't known. He said he didn't understand why I'd never told anyone. He said, and this is the part I've turned over many times since, it would have been nice to be invited. I read that one a few times. Here's the thing I had to be honest with myself about. My brother had called me that October Tuesday and delivered my mother's message, and he had done it the way he'd done everything his whole life. As the messenger who didn't question the message. He wasn't malicious. He was just someone who had grown up inside a certain family dynamic for so long that he'd never thought to push back on it. That didn't make it okay. But it was different from my mother's voice message at 2 a.m., which had the distinct flavor of someone who was angry. Not that I'd been hurt, but that I'd been somewhere she hadn't known about. I thought about what I wanted to say for a long time. I wrote my mother a message and I kept it short. I said, for a long time I had driven 6 hours every November to be somewhere I felt like a guest at a table I'd helped set. I said I had made the decision this year to spend the holiday with people who had actively chosen to be in my life. I said I loved her, and I meant it, in the complicated way you can love someone who has never quite seen you. I said I hoped we could find our way to something better. I did not apologize. I wrote my brother a separate message, shorter. I said, I hadn't told anyone because no one had ever really asked. I said the invitation would have been open if he'd asked. I said I'd like to talk soon, properly, on the phone. I meant that too. I did not respond to my cousin. I did not respond to my mother's brother or the family friend. Those were not my relationships to repair. Then I closed my messages app, put my phone down on the kitchen table, and walked out to the dock. The lake was very still. The maples across the water had gone even deeper red overnight, the way they do up there in October, right before everything drops. I sat at the end of the dock in my jacket with my hands in my lap, and I just looked at it for a while. I wasn't triumphant. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't sitting there feeling satisfied in some cinematic way. What I felt was quieter than that and more final, like something that had been wound tight for a very long time had simply released, like I had stopped waiting for something I had never actually named, but had been waiting for anyway. A loon called out from somewhere across the lake, that long, echoing sound that carries so far over water you can never quite tell where it's coming from. I sat and listened until it stopped. Then I got up, went inside, and started thinking about what to do with the rest of the long weekend.